Hills family, how have you become more like Jesus in the last 6 months? That is a difficult question to answer. It's not like your bank account where it's very clear it's either up or it's down. But measuring our spiritual life is much more challenging. And just because time has passed doesn't mean that you have become more mature. I have come across people who have been going to church for decades, would call themselves Christians, who are, I think, what the New Testament calls spiritual infants. They're just not very mature. And you see their life and you're like, where's the joy? Where's the hope? And they're full of anxiety, and they harbor unforgiveness, and they're stingy with their time and their resources. But then you meet a different kind of person who in that same amount of time looks completely different. Like they love God genuinely, they love their neighbors, they are surprising with their generosity. They have spiritual sons and daughters. The trials of life have not hardened their hearts, but have softened them up to serving others. And what's the difference? How does that happen? And how do we ensure that we're more like the second kind of person? We're starting a new series today called Practicing the Way of Jesus. And I'm excited about the possibilities, and one of the benefits of microchurch is the potential for deep learning and transformation. Because if you hear a lecture, you listen to a podcast, you hear a sermon, like how much of that do you retain? Not much. There is what educators call the learning pyramid. And basically what it says, there's different ways that we learn and how much we retain when we learn through those methods. So you learn and retain about 5% of what you hear in a lecture, which is very disheartening to us preachers who think you ought to listen to our sermons all the time. I will say, if you take notes, you're likely to remember a bit more, so take some notes. But 5% of what you hear in a lecture, 10% of what you learn through reading, 20% through audio visual. And this is honestly, like on Sundays where I put things on the screen because I want you to see it as well as hear it. There are some preachers I've heard like, oh, don't use screens and that's, not authentic. I'm like, listen, brah, look at the prophets. Look at Ezekiel. That guy was using Play-Doh to teach. He was doing theater and drama and demonstrations. So we're okay with the visuals around here. Learners retain 30% of what they learn through seeing a demonstration, 50% of what they learn when engaged in a group discussion, like microchurch, and 75% of what they learn when they practice what they learn. This is one of the reasons why microchurch is so impactful. Not just for this series, but for every series we do, because we're sitting down, we're talking about it, we're engaging with scripture and with the content, we're growing together. And with our new series, we're going to take this to a whole new level. We're putting all of these learning modalities together. And so if you add up the percentages, we're going to be hearing sermons on it, we're going to be reading about it, discussing it, and then putting it into practice. You add all those up, it's over 100% chance that this series will be transformational for all of us. And as we go, there might be times when you're like, Matthew, I think what you just said in the sermon is also in the book. And I'll say, yes, exactly. I'm glad that you are paying attention. And so I will be using resources from the book. Every Monday, I will send a recap of what we've talked about, just a brief summary, and then some recommended resources, and also what you should be reading for that week in the Practicing the Way book. And so this is focused learning in community. The content is good, but I think just the intentionality of us working through this together is going to make all the difference. So in 6 months, when I ask, how are you becoming more like Jesus? We will have some handles for our faith to help us, to inform, like, are we growing more like Jesus? Before our next microchurch, I encourage you to take It's called a spiritual health reflection. A spiritual health reflection. There's a link in the video description. I'll send it in the recap on Monday as well. But you will go to this website, practicingtheway.org/reflection, and there is a 39 question reflection that will help you just kind of evaluate where you are in your spiritual life. Like, are you growing? Are you stagnant? There's questions about forgiveness and confession and serving and delighting in prayer. Even questions about spiritual friendship and sharing your faith. Like, all the things are in this reflection. So here's one of the questions that all of us will be able to answer in the affirmative. The question is, I am committed to meeting often in person with the small community for deep conversations focused on God. And there's a slider on the bottom from agree to disagree, and you go all the way to fully agree or a little bit. But for all of us on this one who are engaged in the microchurch, we're going all the way on that one. So this reflection will take you about 30 minutes. I took the reflection about 8 months ago, and then I took it again this week, and it shows areas where I've grown, or maybe even areas where I've fallen behind. And then once you're finished with the reflection, it gives you some feedback, which is helpful. And one of those feedbacks is areas for growth. And here are some of mine that came up. Now, I didn't include all of my areas for growth because, I've got too much pride for that. But I'll share a couple of them with you here. You can see one of mine is I'm a little weak on the practice of spiritual gifts, which, based on our last series, I'm trying to grow in. I hope you are as well. Another one of my areas for growth is I don't have a regular practice of confession. You can see that at the bottom there. So it gives me like an area for growth, and then you click on it, and then it gives you ideas for strengthening that area, which is super cool and practical. Check it out. This is going to be a 2-month series, and you will get out of it what you put into it, like all things in life. And I encourage you to dive in, to go all in and see what happens, see how God works in your life. And my hope in this series is to clarify what it means to be a disciple of Jesus and to invite everyone into a deeper maturity, intimacy, and practice in their life with Jesus. So are you ready? Let's dive in. So the question to get us started today is, who are you following? Who are you following? When I asked that question, for some reason, the Bob Dylan song, "Gotta Serve Somebody," comes to mind. And the song simply says in the chorus, you're gonna have to serve somebody. It might be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. And so the question, who are you following? Who are you serving? Like it implies that you're gonna have to follow somebody. You might not think you are, but you are following something. You are, or who are you a disciple of? Or what are you a disciple of? We are all disciples of someone or something, and we are being shaped all the time. That's the idea. Whether we're being intentionally shaped or accidentally shaped or just by the culture that we live in, we are being shaped all the time. We are formed by media that we ingest and digest, with our social media, with the streams and the feeds that we follow. We're just constantly being shaped and formed. A study that I saw from just 2024, so just last year, on our use of phones and social media, we haven't gotten any better. The average American spends 4.5 hours on their phone every day. Imagine how that is shaping you. Who are you following? What kind of person are you becoming? And the invitation from Jesus is to follow him. It was the invitation that he gave to his first disciples, and it's the invitation that he gives to us today. So we're going to pick up in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 16. It says, as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little further, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay he called him, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. You've likely heard this story before, but if you stop to consider what is happening, that's a pretty crazy story. Jesus walks up to these two sets of brothers who are going about their work. They're not out fishing on a day off from work. They haven't called into the office sick and then gone out for a little R&R. This is their work. And Jesus says, "Hey, follow me." And they follow Jesus. And at this point, Jesus maybe is a little bit known, but he doesn't have much of a platform. He doesn't have a social media presence. He isn't offering them a fortune or a place to live or future prospects. But they say yes to Jesus. And the invitation, it's a little absurd, but their response is also a bit crazy. They say yes. But what is it they say yes to? They are saying yes to following Jesus, to a whole new way of living. More than just a mental assent to a set of beliefs or ideas. When we say yes to Jesus, we are saying yes to a whole new way of living. So it's more than just believe, as the cat poster there from the Lego movie says. But we've received the same invitation to be disciples of Jesus. In the Western church, discipleship is often tied up with a class or a series of classes or maybe one-on-one mentorship. But what does it mean to be a disciple? Check out this short video from the folks at Practicing the Way, just to give us an introduction to what it meant in the first century to be a disciple.
In first century Israel, you would regularly see rabbis walking along the road or teaching at your village synagogue. The word rabbi means master or teacher. Rabbis were the revered teachers, not just of the Torah or the Bible of their day, but of life with God. Most of them were itinerant. They would travel from place to place to teach, and behind them would be a small group of students called talmidim. The Hebrew word talmid literally means learner, but it can also be translated student or follower. The most common translation is disciple, but a growing number of scholars argue the best word we have in the English language to capture the full meaning of the Hebrew word talmid is apprentice. The philosophy of education in the ancient world was nothing like ours in the modern West, where you go to class, sit through a lecture, and take notes for a test. It wasn't informational, it was formational. The goal wasn't just to learn about something, but to become someone. And discipleship, or apprenticeship, was the pinnacle of the first century Jewish educational system. Jewish kids started school around 5 years old at the Beit Sefer, or the House of the Book, which was the equivalent of elementary school. The primary textbook was the Bible, but it was an oral culture, and by the age of 12 or 13, most students would have memorized the entire Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. At that point, the vast majority of students went home to apprentice in the family business or work the family farm. But the best of the best would go on to a second level of education called Beit Midrash, or the House of Learning, where they would continue their studies. It was built off the side of the synagogue and run by a full-time scribe or teacher. By the age of 17, they would have memorized the entire Old Testament. At this point, the vast majority were done. But the best of the best of the best would go on to apprentice under a rabbi. Let's say you were one of the lucky few who became an apprentice to a rabbi. From that point on, your entire life was organized around 3 driving goals. First, to be with your rabbi. You would leave your family and your village and follow your rabbi 24/7. Apprenticeship was deeply relational. You would walk behind your rabbi on the road, eat every meal with them, keep Sabbath together, be with them all day long. Secondly, to become like your rabbi. The heart and soul of apprenticeship was to be with your rabbi for the purpose of becoming like your rabbi. You would imitate their whole life, copy their mannerisms, adopt their figures of speech. You wanted to be like them. Finally, to do as your rabbi did. The goal of apprenticeship to a rabbi was to one day become a rabbi yourself. And if you made it through the long process of apprenticeship, then when your rabbi felt you were ready, he would turn to you and say something like, "Okay, I think it's time. Go and make disciples." This was what it meant to be a disciple. And this is still what it means to be a disciple.
Do you view yourself as an apprentice to Jesus? There are three goals of the apprentice. The first, to be with Jesus. Second, to become like Jesus. And third, to do what Jesus did. John Mark, in the book Practicing the Way, I think has a great description of an apprentice. He says, apprenticeship to Jesus, that is following Jesus, is a whole life process of being with Jesus for the purpose of becoming like him and carrying on his work in the world. It's a lifelong journey in which we gradually learn to say and do the kinds of things Jesus said and did as we apprentice under him in every facet of our lives. We no longer have apprentice and master and rabbi like they did in the first century, but we still have some spaces around work where apprentice is used, like someone in the trades, or someone becoming a master plumber or master electrician. It's not just something they're learning in a book, but they're coming alongside somebody. They're learning, they're an apprentice to someone who is an expert. It's the same many times in healthcare when you have a doctor who does their schooling, which is very hands-on, but then they have to go into their residency, where they are, in a sense, an apprentice to others who have the experience. My daughter Bennett, she's 8, and we are for the first time going through the Star Wars, the original movies, and then the ones in the 90s. And in Star Wars, of course, they have the apprentice in the master. And the master Jedi is trying to help the apprentice become a master Jedi. And then that Jedi will have an apprentice, someone who they also train. And as we've been as we've been watching Star Wars, I have been reminded of just how mid those movies are. Not that good. I think we can all agree on that. Maybe not. I don't know. But the goal of an apprentice isn't just to know stuff, but to be able to do the stuff. And when you need a plumber, you don't want the plumber showing up and the plumber getting on YouTube and searching, all right, how to fix, That's what I do. When something's broke around here and I don't want to call the plumber, I look it up. When the plumber gets here, I expect the plumber to know what they're doing, for their hands to be not dirty, so to speak, but used to working and fixing what is broken. In the New Testament, disciple is most often used as a noun. It's a relational identity. It has to do with who we are and the kind of person we are becoming. Disciple, it comes from the Greek word mathetes, which is a noun. But it's not just a noun. And as you read Practicing the Way, at one point, John Mark tries to make a very clear distinction that a disciple is a noun, not a verb. And I think he's mostly right, but I also think disciple is a verb, and it's used as a verb in Scripture. So, for example, in what we call the Great Commission in Matthew 28, the last thing that Jesus says to his disciples before he ascends into heaven, Matthew 28:20, says, "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." So you have this little phrase in there, make disciples. And it looks like it's a verb and a noun. You have making, which is a verb, and disciples, like the entity, what you are making, the noun. Two words in English. In Greek, this is one word, one phrase, that is in fact a verb. And it's the verb matheteo. Even if you don't know Greek, you can see that these two words in Greek are very similar. They have almost the same spelling. It's the same with some of our words in English that can be nouns or verbs. So if I say, I am a runner, that is a noun. It is an identity of who I am. But I can also say, I am running. That's a verb. That is action. Both words have the same root. And there are other words in the New Testament besides disciple that speak of action when it comes to being a disciple. So for example, what we just read in Mark a second ago when Jesus says, come and follow me. That is a verb. There's other passages that talk about training and teaching. Also verbs. And in Matthew 28, which we also read, Jesus said, teach them to obey. All kinds of verbi in that passage. And so, but the idea, I think John Mark is correct, that as disciples, it is an identity. It is who we are. It is a whole life process. A disciple is never off duty. It's not like we set this aside, okay, and now I'm here, but it is who we are at our core. That's what we see with the disciples in Mark chapter 1. They leave their personal agendas. They leave their job to follow Jesus. And then it's a journey. And for 3 intense years, they are with Jesus all the time, watching, learning, listening, doing. And they are with the greatest rabbi of all time, and they are dense. They often don't understand. Jesus gets frustrated with them. He has to teach them the same lesson over and over, which it gives me a little hope. It gives me a little hope as a disciple of Jesus that following Jesus does not require perfection, which should give you hope as well. As we are following Jesus, perfection is not required. And Jesus, he didn't pick his disciples from the elite, from the top of the class. He comes up to these guys who are very blue collar, probably limited education. They didn't go on to the higher education that was available to them. They're just working, going about their lives. And Jesus says, come and follow me. At one point, not long after the resurrection, Peter and John, they're speaking before the religious leaders, and they're giving an account, and the religious leaders are upset at what they're doing. But at one point, after John and Peter finish, here's what it says. So in Acts chapter 4, it says, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. That is one of my favorite Bible verses. The religious elite, they are astonished at these everyday guys, just these regular dudes, speaking with clarity and authority and with boldness. And that last little line says they took note that they had been with Jesus. Took note that they were apprentices to Jesus. Took note that they were disciples of the Rabbi Jesus. Do you consider yourself an apprentice to Jesus? In the coming weeks, I want to provide a roadmap for becoming an apprentice to Jesus. And I think most of us want to move in that direction. Like we want to follow Jesus, but maybe we're not quite sure what that looks like or how to go about it. And as we've mentioned, and you'll hear again throughout these 8 weeks that we're in this teaching series, the 3 goals of the apprentice are to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, to do what Jesus did. And discipleship begins with being with Jesus. Later in the Gospel of Mark, it says this about the disciples. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him, that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. Notice that Jesus' first invitation to his disciples is to be with him. Yes, he's going to send them out to preach and to do miracles, But all of that is going to be the result of them first being with Jesus. With Jesus. Earlier this year, I heard someone say, don't be afraid to waste time with Jesus. With Jesus. And that has stuck with me for several weeks now. And discipleship isn't about cramming us full of more information. It is a journey of relational presence where we are invited into a deeper and deeper experience with the living God. We're invited to participate in the life and the love of the triune God. So discipleship is with God before it is for God. Discipleship is with God before it is for God. As we conclude, I want us to do a simple exercise. I want you to imagine your life in 20 or 30 years, maybe 40 years, and imagine what your life will look like if you had been walking as an apprentice of Jesus for the next 2-3 decades. Like what kind of person will you be? What kind of joy, what kind of hope, what kind of anxious-free living will your life exude? What kind of quick to forgive, quick to admit your mistakes, quick to serve others in 20 or 30 years, to be a Jesus follower then? Like what kind of apprentice do we need to be now? Grace and peace.